Hear me now? Okay, so for the last 6 weeks, we've been looking at this from a community approach, because Wilmington, Delaware is like many other cities. It's a small city. It's a shrinking city. We were close to 200,000 at one time, and we've continued, and now we've pretty much stabilized at 86,000. Interestingly enough, like any cities, I think, throughout the East Coast and probably throughout the nation, our strongest communities are contiguous to our park system. And if it wasn't for an entrepreneur named Mr. Bancroft, who owned a large textile mill, we would have no park system in Wilmington, because he, in fact, bought the property, some of the major properties for the park system along the river, tried to have a connector, which the largest parks are located along the Brandywine River. And if you can see up in the corner, there's a little green strip. It's hard to see, but it actually connects. These are properties he bought in the 1800s and built a connector to. It's called the Bancroft Parkway. And in fact, that parkway is still privately owned public parkland. So one of the initiatives we are looking at is how can we construct privately owned public parkland. And the idea of, and let me give you a little bit of our perspective, because we come from a housing perspective. We have spent the last 10 years, and that's West End Neighborhood House, looking at distressed neighborhoods and saying, how can we take distressed neighborhoods and revitalize them? And one of the ways we have has been through the real estate market. Give you a little context, it's a social service agency that became a CDC as well. And so over the last 10 years, we've done about $52 million worth of residential development. Now, I want you to understand that's piece by piece, house by house. So $52 million is a pretty, I think, respectable number since we were starting from scratch. And if you look at the community that we're focusing on right now to get an idea of what could be replicated throughout the city, we focused on the community in which we know. And there's been extensive, if you see all those orange and red dots, that's kind of where our concentration has been by our organization and other organizations in stabilizing very blighted communities. And we've had a great deal of success, and I think we'll share that with you shortly. When I looked at just this part of the city, when we kind of put it in quadrants, if you look at the top quadrant of what we'll call the west side, it was a neighborhood 10 years ago which was transitioning downward. And if you look at the other two quadrants, which don't have a lot of these black dots, they were in severe distress. Through this housing initiative that we've undertaken, we've been able to stabilize 3 of the quadrants. But this fourth quadrant, as you see, all these these are vacant, blighted, foreclosed properties. We think that's where, as we look from a neighborhood level, the opportunity lies. We did some comparisons to say what's happened in the community in which we've worked and what's in the community we haven't worked, which is contiguous. And basically, I think foreclosures are triple, property values are worth 50%. And so we think there's opportunity in this community because it has both residential and commercial strips. And so we don't feel that we can look at just commercial. We need to tackle the whole thing, which is commercial and residential. What we tried to do is look at where are the people at, and where are the parks at. I live in a row home. I live in this community. Do any of you have own a property that has a quarter acre, third of an acre? Any of you in the room? 1, 2. Well, to give you an example, just in this quadrant, there are approximately 5,000 people, about 1,400 youth. They have 1/3 of an acre of open space. So if you pair that back with the previous slide, we have a lot of vacant, blighted properties which we think can be acquired. Now, this is the hard work because there are a lot of parcels. And place it in the area that's has the most need. That's some of the strategies we're starting to look at because we think we'll have a lot of capital from the political, and politics is part of, when you're dealing with land, it's local politics. Secondly, that we think the community would embrace that as well. And the concept of starting to build communities that have proven that they could stabilize in the last gives some hope that a project like this might be able to work quickly and then be replicated throughout the city and the state. By the way, what we've done in this area in housing, we think a lot of the things are the same. Financing, acquisition, investors, and then some of the infrastructures that you've talked about earlier. So we know that our model that we used before, if we can try to modify it, it's been replicated throughout Delaware. Why not try to use the same approach? We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and we only had 6 weeks. Next slide. This is just, again, looking at this quadrant. There's been some improvement in the parks going along. Interestingly enough, the largest park was just created. It was an old reservoir that was open. We utilized the community. We utilized, help me out with the fund. It was Homeland Security money to build this park. It was open reservoirs. We closed it. The initial plan of the city was to fence it off and just cover it. But we were able to actually build an open park with water features. If you look down in the lower quadrant, though, there's, again, this big void of parks, and none of these parks are connected. There is no connection. There's some topography, large hills. And so what we've seen is communities, and we went out and interviewed about 60 different folks, including planners, but community people. Folks in these communities never use the park. And I asked, where do the young people play? And they say, when the gym's open at the local community center, that's their outside. So again, when we're talking about this, we're talking about sales to the local communities, because land in at least Wilmington and private ownership of land or even foreclosed is a real local issue. It's the most local issue, and we want to have some buy-in from a local level. So that's kind of where we're thinking. In addition, we looked at our good parks and our bad parks. Without working with the community, we have some parks right now that are fenced off and closed off, and were not really designed well to begin with. And so one of the things you're going to immediately hear from a pushback from the community is, well, if we're not using all the open space we have right now, why should we create some additional? And so part of what we're looking at is not only creating new space, but how do we work with the folks who are responsible now for the parks and the open space to make it a community asset instead of a community liability. And that's a real issue in my community. I don't know if it's anyone else's community. So we're also talking about that locally. This kind of reflects to the question I asked earlier. I asked Christian, I said, well, where do we stand? And I believe, and help me out, I believe the average for low-density cities, or, intermediate density cities is 10 acres per 1,000 people. Wilmington is hovering around 8, and then the community we're in a little over 2. And so it's just, again, for us to have a perspective, but also the community. I didn't realize I was poor when I was a young man until some of my colleagues in school told me I was poor. I don't think that the local community realizes in many places how large its deficit is in green space. And I think there's there's all the other education we have to do with investors, but we also have to let folks know how we stand in relationship to other cities, in relationship to the county, and people we will be competing with for development money and revitalization money. So we need to know where we are. That's kind of why I asked that question earlier. One of the things we're looking at is, and in this deficit area, is we have a combined stormwater sewer system. I don't know if any of you have that. So what happens in Delaware is when it rains, and it rains hard, our drinking water gets almost contaminated from stormwater that overflows into the river. Why are we looking at? Well, first of all, guess what? This neighborhood receives a lot of that. Secondly, there's opportunity to open it up. Maybe third, there's some other monies. If we're going to deal with our storm, maybe we build open space with underground holding tanks that can hold some retention of it. So we're looking at not just new money coming out of the federal government, but how do we redirect things like Homeland Security? How do we redirect water and sewer problems to combine to have this open space? So that's why I kind of wanted to show that slide. That's something we're thinking about and working on. I talked earlier, and I think this is the percentage of young people in this little microcosm of the city. So again, you see where the highest amount of young people are, the least amount of space. Some of the strategies, and remember, we're gonna be working really hard over the next 6 weeks to catch up with all of you guys. We want to target the sale of this at a local level, and in our strategy to say, where's the greatest opportunity and the greatest need, mirroring those two. And it doesn't always work, but how do you do both? And what we've, go ahead. And how do we also look at commercial and residential together? That past slide is an example. This is a commercial strip in a residential zone. Both streets are. This bank has been empty now for over 10 years. And it's still for lease. But the commercial, and I know you think of these big box areas as commercial, and we have those, but we also have these residential commercial strips. How can we enhance these struggling strips with park space, looking at the corridors, to make it a more walkable, safe community, which will drive some economic development and increase the value of the land contiguous to it? One of the other areas we're looking at as we've been planning is, and these little lines going back and forth, are commercial corridors and trails, urban trails connecting existing green space and newly created, because we don't want to have isolated green space. We haven't done any of that work in most of the city, so we're way behind. So as we look at acquiring property and working with folks, we also want to look at better utilization and connection. I know this is 101 for a lot of you guys, but for us, we're also, most of our streets, and Philadelphia has some of this, are just these large power zones which cars go up and down, but a lot of our commercial is on that, so it really doesn't lend to economic growth because they're seen as transportation corridors in and out of the city, and they're not very easy for people to stop and utilize our commercial. So some of the things we're looking at is softening the areas which will connect the new green space which we want to build along these areas. And that's, the little artist's conception of how that might look. And again, we talked about connecting, but we're also saying how can we use what's our strength, and that is connecting to the parks to do new redevelopment. We've been doing a lot of housing, and that market, as you know, is very soft. The new housing we'd like to do would be contiguous and to the green space which we would acquire. So we're very much like we heard Atlanta talk about, acquiring parcels of property, having the green connected to the redevelopment of specific neighborhoods. In addition, because we want to be flexible and we want to be sensitive to not only this community but other communities we're going to be looking at Wilmington, we're looking at how can we use a variety of properties in a variety of ways. So some big parks which would have to be the shopping center that we would do would be a big park, but also how do we get neighborhood buy-in and community buy-in to have a variety of different kinds of parks. We have not done a lot of work like that in Wilmington, so I think there's huge opportunity. We thought, and we just looked at one neighborhood, and don't get scared by these acquisition costs. Just in one neighborhood, we could easily spend $21 million. I don't think Wilmington would get $5 billion. We might, on a comparative stage, get $100 million. And so how could you parcel that up between community opportunities, neighborhoods, and big parcels? So just looking at one neighborhood from a community perspective, we know we could easily spend $21 million and make the kind of impact of removing a significant portion of obsolete properties. What we're trying to look at is how can we get 50% of the vacant properties off the market? Off the market. These some of the properties in our area have been vacant for a long time. We have a new law in Wilmington which is a very aggressive fining process for vacant properties. And it doubles and triples. And so now the city didn't want the property. The landowner is not paying the fines, and these properties are sitting dormant. We think we can go in with a land banking and group and say, we will negotiate your fines, and we will take this liability away from you, and at least in the initial stages, Wilmington, the city of Wilmington, you do not have to control this property. We will control the property as we acquire parcels in a fairly aggressive manner. I think what we're looking at is trying to double, at least initially in the very deficit areas, the number of park space. We think that's sellable. A couple of things that we have that make us, I think, different, maybe not. We're Delaware. Everybody knows everyone. So for me to get on the phone and call the governor is not a big thing. For me to get on the phone, or any of my colleagues, and have our entire federal congressional group get down and sit down and talk about this, we could probably arrange it very quickly. We started at a local level talking to the city council people and the mayor, and they've embraced the concept. And so we know in the past when we did this around community revitalization and housing, we had a lot of quick response because we're such a small state. And I think we can help at least the larger group with our congressional group. And there, by the way, 2 of them are on the Banking Commission, which FDIC is going to have to deal with. And I'm sure Mr. Biden would lend some support to the overall project. And so we're kind of catching up. We're looking at it from a community level first. We think we have credibility because of what we've done in housing and community revitalization heretofore. And one of the other things that I think is really important is we're putting together a team of stakeholders who've been in the community for a very long time. For example, the organization I represent, we've been in the community 125 years. So the combination of you looking at it from community revitalization, from the hospital, from the foundation, from the university, and from some of the local groups that represent the culture of the people that we think is critical in our team, and everyone we've talked to is excited about it. And the last group that I think is going to give us the most bang for the buck is a group called Woodlawn Trustees. I talked about that park system he also started an organization called Woodlawn Trustees. They actually privately own the majority of open space along the river that is not government owned. And they pay for it because they have also owned a preponderance of a commercial strip called 202, which runs through Wilmington. They rent it to commercial entities, build the boxes, and use those dollars to pay for conservancy and acquiring property, and have been doing it for over 100 years. And have done it all with private funds heretofore. So we think they're going to be a critical team player in this because they've done it quietly for years without any government money. And we want to look at long-term sustainability. We think that federal money could be a good kickstart, but how do we sustain this over a 50, 100-year period is really what we're trying to look at right now.
One quick question. Your model then does not anticipate ever turning these properties over to the municipality maintains?
Well, we got the same pushback everybody else is going to get initially, and that was we can't afford to maintain what we have, and it generates no tax revenue for us. And so we think that, like Atlanta, we need to hold, develop, and then when they realize what it's worth, allow them to take it back. But I think initially...
But your plan anticipates that they may not.
I think you have to plan for both. Because unless your city